Hi, my name is Ciara Eichhorst, and I'm a master's student in the Religion and Culture program at the University of Alabama. And the presentation I will be giving today is titled, It's Not a Religion, It's a New Religious Movements and Government Jurisdiction. So to start, in 2021, YouTuber Trisha Paytas sparked controversy when she shared on social media platforms announcing that she was converting to paganism. This came shortly after she had posted numerous TikTok videos during Hanukkah with captions such as, "When you can't finish conversion classes, so you just pay to be Jewish." Over the course of just a few years, Paytas has identified as Hare Krishna, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and pagan. She even created a cover of her song I Love You Jesus called I Love You Moses after marrying her Jewish husband. These quick and seemingly insincere switches between religious identities have resulted in many people calling Paytas out online for her anti Semitism and religious appropriation. However, I think that Paytas's changing religious identities are an example of how the category of religion is both malleable and strategic. Everyone uses the category of religion strategically, whether they know it or not. And in this presentation, I will be using the case studies of Scientology and Pastafarianism to demonstrate how religion is a category used strategically, and I will be looking at the wider constraints in which these social actors work. I'm not concerned with what religion is or isn't, or whether someone's beliefs are authentic or not. Rather, I'm interested in examining religion as a strategy, particularly in relation to new religious movements, and how these stakes get raised when the government is in a position to define religion. So, the first case study that I want to look at is that of the Church of Scientology. And the actors within this are L. Ron Hubbard, the anti cult movement, and the IRS. So initially, when L. Ron Hubbard started Dianetics, he was very opposed to any sort of religious label being put on it. He identified Dianetics as a science and believed that science and religion could not exist together, that they were direct opposites of one another. But eventually, he did state, "I'd like to start a religion. That's where the money is." And one of his primary stakes in the game of having Scientology identified as a religion is authority. Because before he was identified as a religion, he was having trouble even being identified as a science by the FDA. Dianetics had made some grandiose claims about what it could do as a science, and so the FDA and the American Medical Association were extremely skeptical of L. Ron Hubbard. So the move from science to religion was an attempt to avoid these attacks from the FDA. And Hubbard said, "This stroke will remove Scientology from the target area of overt and covert attacks by the medical profession, who see their pills, scalpels, and appendix studded incomes threatened." And he also sent a letter stating that he wanted to make Scientology a religion to combat psychoanalysis and make money. He also created what he called Scientology 1970, which at the time was how he imagined the movement to look 8 years in the future. And he said, "Scientology 1970 is now being planned on a religious organization basis throughout the world. This will not upset the usual activities of any organization. It is entirely a matter for accountants and solicitors." So, in other words, the move from science to religion was strategic in that it was more bureaucratic and essential. Now, during the 1960s, the anti cult movement was created when there was a proliferation of new religious movements in the United States. But it's not as if the 1960s was the first time that there were new religious movements. If we look at the history of religious intolerance in the United States, we would see that in its early beginnings, when people came over and colonized the United States, there was incredible legal, social, and violent intolerance against religious movements that were perceived to be deviant at the time. Now, in the 1980s, Scientology was called the Cult of Greed and Power by Times Magazine. And so the anti cult movement did have a stake in the game when it came to whether or not Scientology was labeled as a religion or as a cult. Um, Like I said, the 1960s was not the first time that there were new religious movements, so the anti-cult movement had to create kind of a new way to frame what they were doing. And so they created what they called brainwashing, and they claimed that people who were joining new religious movements were not doing so of their own free will. Rather, they had been brainwashed and they needed to be deprogrammed so that they could be removed from these so-called cults. So they relied on this myth that there was something essential about religion, and that essentialism lies in Christianity, and that these new religions were deviating from that essential core of religion and they were dangerous for people. And their stake in the game was that some of these new religious movements, and according to the anti cult movement, Scientology being one of them, went against the mainstream Protestant perspectives of religion during those years. And then the final actor I will be discussing in the case study of Scientology is the Internal Revenue Service. Now, when it comes to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, they can't just label everything as a religion and everything with tax exempt status because otherwise nobody's paying taxes. And the United States doesn't identify a single religion as the official religion of the United States. So, therefore, the IRS's labeling of something as a religion becomes incredibly important because it has legal, constitutional, and financial implications, and it does set precedent. The IRS has no official definition of the word church because that would be unconstitutional, but they do have 13 factors that they use to determine whether something is tax exempt or not. And what those 13 factors are or what they are not is also a strategy. So, tax exempt status was granted to the Church of Scientology in 1956, but then revoked in 1967 after an auditing process. And at one point, even though Scientology was recognized as religious, it did not gain tax exempt status because its revenue was primarily benefiting private individuals. And this matters because the stake in the game for the IRS is that taxes are what support infrastructure, social security, the military, Medicare, etc. So the stake in the game for the IRS is actually really high because they are the chief authority on who does and who does not have to contribute financially to the United States. So my second case study that I want to look at is Pastafarianism. And although Pastafarianism is not viewed as dangerous as Scientology, and it's often considered more satirical than anything else, I think it's a great way to study the use of the category of religion as a strategy. So in this instance, the social actors are Stephen Kavanaugh and the Nebraska State Penitentiary and the Nebraska Federal Court. So we're going to start with Stephen Kavanaugh. In 2016, he was an inmate at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, and he sued staff from NSP for refusing to accommodate his religious requests through the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which I will refer to as RLUIPA from here on out. The federal court determined that Kavanaugh's identification as a Pastafarian did not allow him accommodations through RLUIPA because it is evident to the court that FSMism, Flying Spaghetti Monster, is not a belief system addressing deep and imponderable matters. It is, as explained above, a satirical rejoinder to a certain strain of religious argument. So, what is at stake for Kavanaugh? What does he get from having Pastafarianism recognized as an official religion within the Nebraska State Penitentiary? Prison is a notoriously isolating place, even for a short period of time. It's a place where you're under surveillance 24/7, where you are told where you can and can't walk, who you can and can't talk to, what you can and can't say, what you can and can't wear, etc. So, if you're an inmate and you belong to a religion, it grants you certain privileges that you wouldn't otherwise have. Some of these privileges can include access to another visitor, such as a priest, more time outside of your housing unit or cell, access to being involved in a social group, the ability to be somewhere in the facility that you wouldn't normally have access to, certain special foods that aren't on the menu, more items that you can order in your commissary, the ability to wear something extra, such as a cross, and even access to more classes. And furthermore, it is not uncommon for the parole or probation system to recognize inmates who have converted to a religion during their time in incarceration as a sign that they are more moral than they were when they entered the system, and that they are more capable of rehabilitation and less likely to recidivate or reoffend. So for Kavanaugh, those are all stakes in the game. Now let's look at the next social actor, the Nebraska Federal Court and the Nebraska State Penitentiary. So the Nebraska Court of Appeals, not unlike the IRS, has to be careful about what they designate as a religion because their rulings do set precedent. So if you let one thing count, why are you not letting another thing count? Those are all things that they have to take into consideration when they are determining what gets to count as a religion and what does not get to count as a religion. However, their guidelines for what counts as a religion, those are assigned strategically. So in this particular case, the court did look at the origin of Pastafarianism as a way to determine whether or not they wanted to recognize it as a religion. So Pastafarianism was strategically created to oppose the Kansas Board of Education's decision to teach creationism in schools. So the origin story of Pastafarianism is often invoked to question the authenticity of followers because it did start as an opposition of religion. So the Nebraska State Penitentiary and other correctional institutions, their number one priority is listed as safety and security of the inmates and staff. And so therefore certain religious accommodations may never be allowed because they threaten the safety of staff or other inmates. So that's what's at stake for when the Nebraska State Penitentiary has to decide if they want to recognize something as religion or not. So to summarize, everyone uses the category of religion strategically, whether they know it or not, and government agencies are in a place where they have the jurisdiction to decide what counts as religion and what doesn't. It's important to study these things because of the wider implications that they have. So going back to the example of Trisha Paytas and her changing religious identities, we've identified stakes in the game that she might have, such as gaining more followers. But other people also have a stake in the game when Trisha Paytas gets to decide what religion she affiliates with and which one she doesn't, such as those affected by the proliferation of anti-Semitism or the furtherance of people not taking a certain religion seriously and using Paytas's platform as yet another reason to be intolerant towards a certain religion. And while certain groups might seem silly or satirical, such as Pastafarianism, designations of a group as a religion by government institutions can have many repercussions. For example, I'm sure we're all aware of the incident a few years ago when the owner of a bakery was awarded the right to refuse service to members of the LGBTQ plus community because of their religion. So while the Pastafarians are just asking to wear a colander on their head for their driver's license picture, other people are asking for the right to discriminate against people based on their race, sexual orientation, and gender. And each designation sets a precedent, and whether that designation is right or wrong is not something I'm here to argue. Rather, I'm here to note that these classification acts do have consequences. So, what's the takeaway from this presentation? I used the examples of Scientology and Pastafarianism to present my case about how social actors use the category religion strategically, but we could quite literally look at any other case we want to. The Satanic Temple and abortion, the FBI and the Branch Davidians, or even religions or religious words that have been adjectivized. Radical Islam, corrupted faiths, abuse of religion, because these adjectives that have been placed in front of these religions indicate an attempt to say that there's something essential about that particular religion or religions in general that makes certain acts radical or a certain way of practicing a religion corrupted. And that, in and of itself, is also a strategy. So, to end, Winifred Sullivan argues that religious freedom is impossible because everyone has a different definition of religion. And I don't disagree, but I would go further and argue that those definitions are all strategic. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, you can contact me at my Alabama email. Thank you so much.